Every time he concedes something to Republicans, he's losing Democrats. Every time you might concede something to Democrats, he's losing Republicans, instead of having some sort of middle moderate appeal. It's kind of the worst of both worlds.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Mark Hemingway. Subscribe over at undercurrents.tv. It's just $1 for your first month. Join the community. You can ask me questions. You get paywalled episodes. Make sure to subscribe here, wherever you get your podcasts to. We appreciate it. Now, this is the craziest news week ever. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is here in D.C. sitting for his Senate confirmation hearings to lead the massive Department of Health and Human Services, where he would oversee the federal medical bureaucracy, basically. Senate Democrats and even some Republicans absolutely grilled Kennedy on a very diverse range of issues. Here's a taste of that.
If Mr. Trump, as he did yesterday, orders a halt on Medicaid payments that are essential for taking care of people with disabilities all around this country, you're going to follow that order because you are willing to sacrifice your values, your knowledge, if President Trump tells you to do that. That, to me, is unacceptable in a Secretary of Health and Human Services.
You say one thing, and then you say another. In your testimony today, in order to prove you're not anti-vax, you note that all your kids are vaccinated. But in a podcast in 2020, you said, and I quote, you would do anything, pay anything to go back in time and not vaccinate your kids. Mr. Kennedy, all of these things cannot be true.
I happen to believe that climate change is real, it's an existential threat, and it is a healthcare issue. Donald Trump thinks that it is a hoax originating in China. Question is, in your judgment, is climate change a hoax or is it real, causing devastating problems?
President Trump and I, from the beginning, from our first meeting, agreed to disagree on that issue. I believe climate change is existential. My job is to make Americans healthy again.
All right, you believe that you disagree with Trump, you don't think climate change is a hoax, is what I'm hearing.
My job here is to make
Americans healthy. I'll just ask you that, Mr. Kennedy, not a trick question.
I answered your question, Senator Sanders.
Okay, you disagree with the president on that.
I answered your question.
Okay.
Kennedy's arc is pretty well known at this point. He was a well-liked fixture in liberal circles for his environmental work over the course of decades, even despite his deep skepticism of vaccine mandates and the medical establishment. He ran against Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and then endorsed Trump after having been pretty critical of him on the campaign trail. He brought the MAHA, Make America Healthy Again movement into MAGA, and is very quickly transforming the way Republicans, even like establishment Beltway Republicans, think about health and wellness. He's also transforming the way people who care about health and wellness think about Republicans. Now, FBI nominee Kash Patel's criticism of his potential agency was much more commonly found on the political left until about 5 years ago. Actually, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as a liberal, shared a lot of those critiques. Republicans, like Patel, came to believe in those ideas after they watched, and Patel up close, intelligence agencies try to thwart Trump. Patel is also testifying in this incredibly packed news week, which is bringing us incredible exchanges between the Senate and Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, and Patel, in addition to the first White House press briefing of Trump 2.0 and some significantly radical reforms to the bureaucracy. Let's take a look at Kash's hearing in the Senate.
And as FBI director nominee, he's chosen someone whose primary qualification, in my view, is his willingness to say yes when everyone else would say no to whatever the president wanted. To say whatever he wanted, to do whatever he wanted. That's why he is sitting here. I mean, look at the people who held that job before Mr. Patel. The stature of the people that held that job. The qualifications of the people that held that job. And how can any of us think that his background, his qualifications hold a candle to the people who went before him? How did we get here where we are defending a nominee like this?
Why are the Democrats so afraid of you?
I don't know, Senator. You'd have to ask them.
Well, I tell you what I think. And listening to their questions and your responses, which we appreciate, they know that you're going to go in and you're going to clean up that political cabal that has been over there for years. You are going to reposition the FBI to its core mission. You stated that earlier in this hearing, and there will be no more political persecutions and no more two tiers of justice. And they have liked having 2 tiers of justice. They have enjoyed it.
Did you say that the FBI headquarters should be shut down and reopened as a museum of the deep state?
Mr. Chairman, are we allowed to go an extra time?
Let's see. You get a second round. Before I call on Senator Lee.
Could he just answer the question if he said that the FBI headquarters, where they investigate cybercrime and terrorism, should be shut down and opened as a deep state,
Hey, Mr. Chair.
as a museum? Did he say that the headquarters should be shut down?
Mr. Chair.
I deserve an answer to that question. He is asking to be head of the FBI, and he said that their headquarters should be shut down.
Mr. Chair, parliamentary inquiry.
You got anything you want to say, Mr. Patel, before I go on to Senator Lee?
Simply this. If the best attacks on me are going to be false accusations and grotesque mischaracterizations, the only thing this body is doing is defeating the credibility of the men and women at the FBI. I stood with them here in this country. In every theater of war we have, I was on the ground in service of this nation. And any accusations leveled against me that I would somehow put political bias before the Constitution are grotesquely unfair. And I will have you reminded that I have been endorsed by over 300,000 law enforcement officers to become the next director of the FBI. Let's ask them.
Senior writer at Real Clear Investigations, Mark Hemingway, a longtime conservative journalist who has tracked the realignment in D.C. just about as long as anyone, joins us now to break down reactions to Kennedy, to break down reactions to Patel, as we try to make sense of all of this. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
This RFK Jr. hearing in the Senate has been absolutely wild, but not surprisingly wild. Like, this was the most predictable melee ever, but I wanted to just start by taking your temperature on it. Like, were you surprised by anything? Have we learned anything significant from the questions?
I don't think so. I mean, the problem was always going to be that, whatever RFK's redeeming qualities are, I mean, he said, and I think there are substantial redeeming qualities, particularly as he's presented himself the last couple of years, but he's been in public life for decades, and he's said a lot of very crazy, wild stuff. And so the idea that this wouldn't come up, it was always going to require some sort of extraordinary effort to kind of sell him, and because there was going to be a lot of ammunition for people that would be opposed to Trump, or even Republicans who, were concerned that Trump was aligning with himself with a guy who's been a, not just a Democrat, but sort of a radical guy for decades.
I've heard from MAGA sources today, as the hearing's been going on, that they feel actually like a little bit nervous. They've been pretty confident about all of the nominees getting through. Hegseth was a big boost to everybody on that because, J.D. Vance broke the tie, and Hegseth was quite an uphill battle in and of itself. But they seem shakier today about whether Kennedy is able to get through. Maybe that's not surprising either, but what do you make of his odds? He's got more rounds of questions coming, so more opportunity to improve, or I guess more opportunity to scare them too.
I am not super confident on RFK getting through, unfortunately. Again, remember, you've got a guy here who's being attacked in some part because he's, completely betrayed his former party, by aligning with Donald Trump. There was some hope that people would see the fact that I think he's a former Democrat and certainly very liberal on a lot of issues as a plus, that he could maybe attract some sort of, people from across the aisle. But I mean, I think that the sense of betrayal and as crystallized by the insane reaction from his own family, who've been, out on the warpath publicly against him. I mean, remember the Kennedy family circled the wagons around RFK Jr.'s uncle, who literally murdered a woman, William Kennedy Smith, who, had a very public rape trial. I mean, they were very supportive of family members through those things, but RFK aligning himself with Donald Trump and Republicans was a bridge too far. And I think a lot of Democrats feel similarly about that. I mean, it's very tribal in that sort of sense. And then there's, the things that RFK, himself has done and said that, seem pretty questionable over the years in terms of conspiracy theories that he's endorsed and this and that.
Yeah, so if you are a kind of standard Republican senator, or let's say you're even a MAGA Republican senator, we've had Tommy Tuberville on the show kind of talking about RFK Jr. He's super supportive of him, but he said the first question he asked him was about abortion when they met before the holidays. What is front of mind for them? Is it the conspiracy theories? Is it being pro-choice for most of his career? Like, what is giving Republicans pause as they consider whether or not to take that yes vote?
Well, certainly the abortion stuff probably gives Republicans pause on a lot of stuff and a lot of the debatable stuff on vaccines and things like that. I do think that there is this sort of split here in terms of a lot of people who are skeptical of the COVID vaccine, but still most people think that childhood vaccines that he's been very questioning of over a long period of time are still roughly safe, even I think there are legitimate concerns about the number of vaccinations and the vaccination schedule we have for Americans. Broadly, children need to be vaccinated, and the fact that he's been so publicly questioning of that makes it feel like people can't really trust him. So he's kind of stuck in this no-go zone where there's a lot of Democrats that don't trust him because he's betraying them and their party, and then there's a lot of Republicans that aren't convinced that he's fully on board with the program on abortion and things like that. Now, I do think that, like on abortion in particular, Trump's stance that he's kind of arrived at, where he's kind of like the Bill Clinton line on abortion from the 90s, safe, legal, and rare, is kind of where I think Trump is trying to position himself. And that makes it somewhat easy for RFK, if you look at how he's moderated on abortion in terms of talking about the states handling it and stuff, and, understanding it from a libertarian perspective, I, as someone who vehemently disagrees with abortion, should not be funding abortions with federal tax dollars. And so I think that, they can arrive on some sort of middle position on that. But then again, you have this problem where the Democratic Party is still, abortion until crowning. And there's a lot of energy in the party post Dobbs about that. And there's a lot of special interests that are pushing on that. So RFK might be, every time he concedes something to Republicans, he's losing Democrats. Every time you might concede something to Democrats, he's losing Republicans. And instead of having some sort of middle moderate appeal, it's kind of the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, that is a great point. How do you think he's handled it so far? I mean, obviously there's still more time, but it's just that if you're him, this is, to your point, a horrible position to be in. It's a very difficult job to sell yourself to these senators. No matter what you think of the guy, it's a very difficult job. So how have you seen his performance so far?
Look, he's a very articulate guy, and he's very smart. And I do think that one of the reasons why he's in this position that he's in is that he has very much moderated and landed on a sort of consistent message the last 2 years that I think is much more sort of publicly palatable than a lot of the sort of extreme things that he's done in the past. Yes, it's true. Every once in a while, he fires off an errant, wild comment or something like that. But, so does Donald Trump. And I think people are broadly forgiving of that. I think where RFK needs to go and present himself, and he needs to be careful as he does. It's got to be, he's threading sort of a tricky needle here. But with Hegseth, there's an analogy here that's sort of interesting to me. Like, a big part of the problem with the military right now is kind of a PR issue and a recruiting crisis. And, a lot of the concerns about Hegseth were driven toward, the broader sort of like policy arguments and things like that. But the reality is that, the DOD himself, probably isn't making a lot of granular policy decisions. He's surrounding himself with a lot of good people, hopefully, who can, filter down sort of the political program and sort of the things that people voted for down to sort of the policy level. And the Hegseth is uniquely suited to be like the PR guy for the Defense Department. And I think is a younger, good-looking infantryman. He's very well suited to fix the recruiting crisis for the military and a few other, major PR problems the military has right now in terms of, forever wars and things like that. I think he'd be very good at going out and addressing those, with his personal story, his military career, and his broadcasting experience. Same thing with RFK, where I think that, RFK needs to sell himself as, a guy who can be a very effective promoter for public health. And I think he's been exceptional about that. I mean, I think that, whatever debates there are about seed oils and what other crap that's going on right now, RFK's, podcast appearances and stuff over the last, year or two, you may not agree with what he's saying, but in terms of, PR, they've been just sort of magisterial. And he's come across as someone who is very sincerely devoted to improving the overall public health of the American people. And a lot of that is a PR concern. There's a lot of that is getting a message out. And I think RFK Jr. is very uniquely suited to do that in a way that, past career bureaucrats heading the NIH weren't. And I think if he can sell himself as that guy, that would have a lot of broad appeal, because we have this crazy situation where, like I said, he was in this weird Goldilocks zone where he's, every time he concedes the conservatives, he's repelling Democrats and vice versa. That's a situation where you get the horseshoe theory in full effect, where granola Democratic moms in California are coming together with, the right-wing trad wife influencers and agreeing on things. And so I think if he can sell that message, then he's got a chance.
Amazing, because you're also in a unique position here, given that you're from Crunchy, Oregon, and have worked at these conservative media outlets. You were at the Weekly Standard, like a bastion of the neoconservative establishment. And I guess, Mark, I'm curious if you ever thought you would see this from the Republican Party. To me, it just is, mind-boggling. And I've been doing this not quite as long as you. I never ever thought I'd see anything like this.
I have been covering politics for 26 years. I'm old enough to remember the Reagan presidency pretty well. I've never seen anything like this in terms of a party and everything being so quickly unified and happy about what's going on. Now, granted, it is very early. But it is really interesting to see all this coming out of the gate, and moreover, this all being the result of such a broad coalition of people that emerged so quickly. I read this amazing thing. I can't remember, was it in the infamous New York Magazine story about young conservatives that everybody's been chattering about online, where the log cabin Republicans talked about how they didn't hold an inaugural event because they felt that they were so well represented and welcome throughout the Republican Party. That's just an astonishing thing, considering where we've come in terms of expanding this coalition. And there's a lot of concern from quote unquote principled Republicans and libertarians and things like that about the Republican Party drifting left and surrendering its principles to incorporate this broader tent. But whatever you want to say about that, the concerns about the drift, it happened very organically, and I think it's very sincere in terms of expanding the tent.
Another thing I also never thought I would see Republicans doing is going on the offensive against the FBI. And few people are in a position to better articulate the arguments against the status quo at the FBI, maybe not against the department itself, but against the status quo at the FBI, than Kash Patel, who has been making that argument to senators as he's battling for his confirmation as well. I think he has an easier road ahead of him than Bobby Kennedy or Tulsi Gabbard. But Mark, how has Kash Patel, do you think, been a part? You've seen this up close, but he's been a part of actually explaining to people who didn't get it, who didn't follow the ins and outs of Russiagate very closely, about how bad this was. Is he having a lot of success in that?
We'll see. I think you kind of hit on it there earlier. The big rap against Kash Patel for the longest time was that he was this radical who was trying to destroy the institutional and national security apparatus by speaking out against them on false pretenses. The problem is that 8 years later, it turns out that Kash Patel was right about everything. There were gross abuses within the FBI in terms of, how they investigated a duly elected president for non-existent crimes based on, Democratic Party opposition research. It's one of the most astonishing scandals in American history, and he was completely right about it all along. So the charge that he is some sort of reckless force within, the American, law enforcement, national security apparatus just doesn't hold water. He was correctly trying to reform it. And the crazy thing is that Democrats are still frozen in amber, that they're still trying to make that argument. Was that hit piece by, Natasha Fusion GPS Bertrand of Politico the other day was all about how the CIA had opened an investigation into Kash Patel. That's practically an endorsement of him at this point in time. I think that's what it said. The CIA was investigating or something. That was supposed to wave people off of him. And no, people are looking for systemic reform of these things from the outside. And I think that it's going to be very hard for people to make the argument that he's some radical on these issues when he was in fact right all along. If RFK was, trying to get ahead of the NIH right now, and we had definitive proof that seed oils and red dye number 3 were making people obese, then it'd be easier for RFK to get confirmed, and instead of him having to, make these sort of, arguments that are accepted by the mainstream. But at this point in time, I think all Americans, and certainly most of the Republican Congress, have accepted Kash Patel was right all along.
And Kennedy and Patel are similar in some respects in that Donald Trump is addressing a problem basically everybody at this point understands, obesity, for example, completely out of control. And then you look at the FBI and people are like, ooh, yeah, even the Mueller report had some criticisms, significant criticisms of the FBI. And so he's responding to what people can at least somewhat acknowledge are problems with just a sledgehammer. And I'm curious about Kash in that regard. Do you think Republican senators who may be amenable to this idea of reforming the FBI look at Kash Patel and say, holy smokes, this is blowing up the FBI? Talk about that dynamic.
So we have this problem where if you really look at what the FBI did during Russiagate and a bunch of other things that they've done that they've been involved in recently, where, spying on parents who complain at school board meetings, spying on Latin mass Catholics. really, really egregious stuff. I mean, not just that, like the history of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover and things like that. I mean, for its entire history, the FBI has kind of been sort of a rogue agency, and it really came to a head in the last 8 years. I mean, a lot of Americans want to, raise the Hoover building and salt the earth where it stood. I mean, just the fact the FBI headquarters is still in the year of our Lord 2025, named after J. Edgar Hoover, ought to give you pause about what that institution has been like. There's this problem where the American people want much more radical reform of the FBI, and it's a really bizarre thing because the partisan split on this is sort of insane. Like the Democratic Party, my entire life until Donald Trump became president, was very anti-FBI because of CONTELPRO and things like that. And you even saw this. It was crazy when Joe Biden pardoned Leonard Peltier, who was this big, cause on the left for 50 years or whatever, this Native American left-wing terrorist who killed 2 FBI agents, and they were all justifying it on a radical political program, claiming he was a political prisoner. It was like, there was, from the time when there was a tremendous amount of Democratic Party left-wing animus against the FBI. But all of a sudden it just flipped on a dime when Trump became president. And the American people, I think, rightly see this as the Republicans were wrong for so long to be so unquestioning of the FBI. And now the Democrats are wrong for being so, uniformly supportive. The problem is that the national security apparatus still has this hold on lawmakers, where they do this thing where the FBI drags a bunch of lawmakers into a skiff and shows them some like really scary counterterror thing that they're working on, and says, we don't get more funding, or if you don't confirm this person, or whatever is on their wish list, then this terrible thing is going to happen and thousands of Americans are going to die. And we've seen these issues pop up over and over again that turn out to be like false threats, but it still is very effective with Republican leaders. And so I wonder how much sway the national security apparatus still has on resisting reform by, scaring lawmakers.
Yeah, no, it makes you wonder, given Mike Johnson kind of flipping on 702, he even went on Glenn Greenwald's show and talked about how badly 702 needed to be reformed, and then flips on it as he's speaker. It makes you wonder if, under a more establishment, though I would argue competent from conservative perspective, head of the DOJ like Pam Bondi, does Kash Patel get reined in ways that he's unhappy with? It seems unlikely to me that happens, Mark, but I suppose these are very powerful people.
Well, let me go one further and make this a spicy podcast here. Remember that story that just came out about how Cassie Hutchinson, the Republicans didn't want to investigate her too much because they were going to find out she had all these texts from Republican congressmen that were, flirting with her or sexting with her or whatever. And then there was that famous Chuck Schumer comment about how you don't want to cross the, intelligence agencies because they've got a million ways from Sunday to destroy you. You do wonder, like, if there are actual people in Congress being blackmailed. You remember, John Brennan of the CIA was literally caught spying on members of Congress. You got to wonder what kind of hold they have a Republican congressman that goes beyond scaring them. Are they like actively blackmailing these guys? I mean, like I would not put it past criminal intelligence apparatus to do unsavory things like that.
Yeah, and they do try to connect Kash Patel to QAnon, which is interesting because I think at one point he interacted with a Twitter account that had a QAnon thing in it. And I kind of think, Mark, that doesn't work anymore. Like doesn't seem to me the straw that's going to break the camel's back when it comes to Patel. I'm curious what you think, because senators are, I'm sure, talking about that ad nauseum. But Trump interacted with some of those accounts too, I believe. If memory serves, it just, to me, that seems like sort of desperate.
Oh, it's just silly. I mean, like one of the things about having this robust online discourse we have on X, or God forbid Blue Sky, and other parts of the information superhighway where it's a bad idea to roll down the window, is that it is this freewheeling, robust conversation. Like, it is actually useful on some level to entertain outside voices, or people that are fringe voices, or people that are maybe even have pretty wild ideas, because oftentimes those people, well, they might be wrong in the facts, they might be pointing at some sort of larger truth. And obviously I think the QAnon stuff was, crazy nonsense, but the fact that it existed to the level it did for a long time, or to some extent, I guess it's still extant, really spoke to something about sort of the political, discourse in America, and to, ignore it is at your peril. And I think, paying attention to it to some degree and even interacting with it to some degree isn't the worst thing, as long as it's obvious that you're not fully sold on what it's doing, or in the case of QAnon, maybe sold at all on what it's doing. So it's kind of an absurd charge.
Yeah. Well, just looking back at everything, Mark, before I let you go, you think this is an enduring change in the Republican Party? I mean, this is the most ideologically diverse, if that's the right word. I was going to say unorthodox cabinet, not just for a Republican, but I think of any president that he sort of put forward, at least in terms of the nominations. Does this permanently change the Republican Party? Too early to tell?
It's too early to tell. I'm sure it has, like on some fundamental issues, like 25 years ago or whatever, 27 years, I forget when it was, had the Southern Baptists like boycotting Disney over their policy of hiring, gay employees or whatever. And now you have a Republican Party, of course, that totally, like I said, accepting of, gay people within the coalition. Obviously, some of those things, you're not putting Pandora back in the box on in terms of, what hardcore social conservatives might have liked. On the other hand, I think that people often look at these questions through sort of the wrong way in terms of how the Republican Party is handling this stuff. Is the rhetoric behind the principles didn't match reality. So like Trump's approach to trade, for instance, is a good example. My entire adult life, Republicans stood for free trade. I still believe in free trade. But what I realized, and it was Donald Trump, that brought me to this realization, making an issue of it. What I understood to be free trade and free trade deals were not free trade deals. These were multilateral 1,000-page agreements with all kinds of exceptions. And, all along, Canada and bordering the U.S. had tariffs on dairy and other things like that. And we just broadly accepted this and say, well, we have mostly free trade with Canada or whatever, when the reality was it was so much more complicated than that. And so there was a lot of sort of, naked self-interest and lobbying and things like that were sold to us under the principles of freedom. And the Republican Party was the cover for that. And Donald Trump has really ripped the lid off of that. I don't like the idea of tariffs, but tariffs are useful as a tool, for instance, for getting to free trade. And Donald Trump has explicitly said that at several times. And every time he mentions tariffs, the quote unquote free traders lose their minds without, I think, being, cognizant of the complexities behind the debate. It's just, free trade good, tariffs bad, without understanding how those two things might interact with each other. It's on an intuitive level, because obviously the average American voter doesn't understand, the complexities of specific policies. But on an intuitive level, Americans understand the practiced complexity versus, these, simplified political rhetoric that they've been sold for so many years on so many naked partisan lines is just not right. And the fact that Trump is a guy that's coming along and, even though he's nominally Republican, is scrambling the traditional left-right Republican-Democrat distinctions, they are intuitively pro that, not just because it allows them to say that they're not, despite the fact that Trump has a lot of personal allegiance, in a weird way that makes him less tribal. Maybe you're less tribal to support Trump in that regard compared to the political lines that have been drawn for the last several decades prior to him. I think the American people want less tribalism and more effectiveness. And whether Donald Trump achieves that with his executive orders and all these rapid things, it seems like that's exactly what he's trying to sell the American people.
That is so well said. Mark Hemingway, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
One of the things I was just thinking of as Mark was talking was that Republicans right now have an advantage politically because their criticisms of the political establishment are credible, and Democrats' criticisms of the political establishment coming from people like Kamala Harris or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi just aren't. So if the country is in an anti-establishment mood, you want to have people who are at least credible in their anti-establishment sentiments. So it doesn't mean that somebody like RFK Jr. is right about everything or Kash Patel is right about everything, but it means it's kind of easier to sell their perspective to the public because the public buys that they're sincerely anti-establishment as opposed to their critics. Just an interesting thing that I was thinking about while Mark was going through that. So great to have him here. Make sure to subscribe at undercurrents.tv, join the community, $1 for your first month, and then you get to ask me questions, you get paywalled episodes, and please subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to leave us a review, that's always so helpful. We appreciate you sticking with us on this busy news week, and we'll be back with more soon.